All right, conditional statements. So conditional statements are statements that create some kind of condition. So a lot of us, our parents gave us lots of conditional statements when we were growing up. If you don't clean your room, then you can't watch TV. They've established a condition. The condition is if you don't clean your room, the conclusion is going to be, or the result is going to be, you cannot watch television. So they've right there established a condition. So that's what conditional statements are. And the reason we talk about conditional statements in geometry is because conditional statements are the basis of all of our theorems and our definitions, especially our theorems. Our theorems are founded on conditions. Same thing with postulates. And so we need to learn the language and learn how we can manipulate these statements. We also need to know if the statements can be said different ways and still hold their truth value. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So the first thing we're going to look at is conditional statement. It's written in if-then format. So the statement is written in if-then format. The hypothesis is the phrase following but not including the word if. I know I talked to first and second period about changing the definition a little bit, but technically we don't want to include the word if in the hypothesis. We're not going to include that word. It's just what follows it. That's what the meaning of this was. So this is okay. What you have written also for first and second period is fine. So if I look at the hypothesis, it's what is the condition that has to be present. The hypothesis is the condition that has to be present. The conclusion is the then, the result. So hypothesis is what has to happen first, what condition has to be present, and the conclusion is what's going to happen if that condition is present. So I'm going to look at my first example here. Okay. So my first example is going to say, state the hypothesis and conclusion of the conditional statement below. Well, the hypothesis, remember, is the condition that has to be present, the if part. It says, if you have no more than 2 absences and a B average, then you can exempt your final. So our condition that is set, our standard that is set, is if you have no more than 2 absences and a B average. So my hypothesis is going to be you have no more than 2 absences and a B average. Okay, so that's my hypotenuse. We're thinking the wrong thing here. That's what happens to me sometimes. So that is your hypothesis. The conclusion is going to be if you meet that condition, then you can exempt your final. Now notice I didn't write the if and then as part of the hypothesis and conclusion. The if and then just identify. I know in some of the examples we've done that, but we're going to go ahead and drop those out. So you have no more than 2 absences and a B average. That's your hypothesis. You can exempt your final. So let's look at the next one. The next one, it says to rewrite it as an if-then statement. So I'm going to make this a conditional statement. It says a car with poor brakes is a menace on the highway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this as a conditional. I'm going to say if a car has poor brakes, if a car has poor brakes, then it is a menace on the highway. Okay, and I'm not going to necessarily write it all out. Okay, on the highway. So now I want to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. So I'm going to identify the hypothesis. Well, the hypothesis, the condition that has to be there first is that the car has poor brakes. Okay, the car has poor brakes. Okay, if that condition is present, then the conclusion is it is a menace on the highway. I could put a little more space there. Okay, so you're getting the idea behind the hypothesis and the conclusion, the if and then. Okay, all right, so let's look at example 3. Example 3 says rewrite the statement below as a conditional statement. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to rewrite this as a conditional statement. It says Miss Ellison gives her students homework on days that end in Y. So I'm going to change this to if Miss Ellison gives her students homework then, okay, if Miss Ellison gives her student homework, then the day ends in Y. Okay, so I'm going to, again, I'm going to look at my if and my then. So the hypothesis is, the condition that has to be there is that she gives her students homework. The hypothesis is Miss Ellison gives her students homework. And I'm going to abbreviate a little bit. Okay, then the conclusion is going to be the day ends in Y. Now, we talked about in first period, I know particularly, it being okay to interchange these. But as you look at it, as I go back and look at it, you can't change these interchangeably here, because if she gives homework, then the day ends in Y. If you change it, which is the converse we're going to talk about next, it says, if the day ends in Y, then she gives her students homework. Well, technically, that's not necessarily true. Just because the day ends in Y doesn't mean she's giving them homework. She may not be giving them homework every single day. It just says if she gives homework, it has to be a day that ends in Y. She could be like us and only give homework that's due on Tuesday. So that day ends in Y. If I give homework, it's due on a day that ends in Y. It's due on Tuesday. That doesn't mean I'm giving homework every single day that ends in Y. So that's how you do the conditional statements with the hypothesis and conclusion.